Let's begin once again in Minneapolis, the city where 45-year-old George Floyd was killed. Protesters taking to the streets, as we said, for a fourth straight night. This despite an 8 p.m. curfew imposed by the city. Some setting cars and businesses on fire, others looting stores. Tear gas and rubber bullets were used by police to disperse the crowd. Minnesota State Governor Tim Walz saying those responsible for the fires and the looting are not honoring Floyd's death.
And last night is a mockery of pretending this is about George Floyd's death, our inequities, our historical traumas to our communities of color. Because our communities of color and our indigenous communities were out front fighting hand in hand to save businesses that took generations to build. Infrastructure and nonprofits that have served a struggling community were torn down and burned by people with no regard for what went into that. So let's be very clear. The situation in Minneapolis is no longer in any way about the murder of George Floyd. It is about attacking civil society, instilling fear, and disrupting our great cities.
Again, that was the Minnesota governor. And for more, let's go to Minneapolis right now. CNN reporter Nadia Romero is standing by with the latest. So Nadia, thank you for joining us today. Walk us through what is happening right now on the streets of Minneapolis.
Well, Michael, as you mentioned, people are waking up to a lot of destruction. It was contained to the south side of the city, but we are right now about a mile and a half away from the 3rd Precinct, where we saw a lot of the protests. It has since spread out all across the city. Behind me, you can see the Minneapolis Fire Department. They've been working on this block all morning long, trying to put out several businesses that were intentionally set on fire overnight. But then if you take a wider view, something remarkable has happened here in Minneapolis. At first, it was just one person, then another, and then all of a sudden, dozens of people showed up. You can see them here with brooms and trash bags, and they're trying to clean up the mess left behind after peaceful protests turned into riots. And we asked them, are you with a group? Where'd you come from? There's a global market right next to us that was left unscathed. It is a minority-owned business and building full of small business owners. Protesters did not do anything to that building. It is the only building in this area besides the condos next door that were not touched. This all scorched the global market not. They're handing out trash bags and brooms, asking people to help clean up. And there was a Facebook call. And now we're seeing dozens of people cleaning up after the riots and the protests that happened yesterday. Really remarkable here, Michael. The spirit of Minneapolis coming together. Still, though, anger, frustration over the death of George Floyd and the other racial inequities we've been dealing with in this country for such a long time. Michael?
Well, certainly we keep tracking these conflicting emotions, both scenes of fear and also, as you say, behind you, scenes of hope today. I am wondering, though, because last night was the 4th night of violence and rioting that we saw not only in Minneapolis but other cities across the United States. But from your vantage point, from what you are hearing, why are people still taking to the streets after the officer involved has now already been charged with murder?
Well, it's because of how long it took. It still took 4 days for that officer to be charged. And we have the 3 other officers who were involved in the killing of George Floyd that have yet to be charged. And this just isn't only about George Floyd. 4 years ago in 2016, Philando Castile, a black man who worked in a school cafeteria, was sitting in his car when he was shot and killed by a police officer here in Minnesota. That officer was not convicted in a court. And so you have all of these cases. Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, who was gunned down by 3 white men who decided that he deserved to be shot and killed, that they would be the judge, jury, and executioner. This is something that we're seeing in our country today in 2020. We saw it 4 years ago in 2016. We saw it with Trayvon Martin, and the stories go on and on and on, even to Emmett Till, of white people killing unarmed, innocent black people in the streets. This just isn't solely about George Floyd. This is about all of the racial inequities that we've seen and what comes of it. Do these officers ever get arrested? Do they get charged? Do they get convicted? How often do they actually go to jail? And too often we hear the excuse, "I feared for my life," as if this this brown skin makes you a criminal or a threat. That's what we're dealing with in this country, and that's why the riots and the protests will continue.
Nadia, thank you for that. CNN reporter Nadia Romero in Minneapolis.